Hi everyone, my name is Amirth Arunachalam. I'm a junior studying Comp Sci and Applied Math. And my topic is language loss and why it's a global issue. So before we can go into language loss as a global issue, first we should discuss what are the different types of language loss. So first you have language loss on a personal or familial level. This can be found actually probably somewhere in this classroom. Like for example, who speaks a language other than English? How many of you know how to read and write in the same language? So that is an example of language attrition right there. As generations go on, languages are lost. Another example is an entire language can be lost when it ceases to be spoken at all. An example of this is in indigenous communities found in the United States. A lot of Native American cultures are being lost because people don't speak the language anymore and all the elders die off. So the question that should be addressed is, does it matter? And a professor of literature from Columbia, John McWhorter, made a very interesting case, which is, would it be inherently evil if there were not 6,000 spoken languages but one? We must consider the question in its pure logical essence, apart from particular associations with English and its history. So there's a couple assumptions that he's making when he says this. He's assuming that English will become the default language, and that does it really matter that all of these languages could go extinct? And the goal of this presentation is to say that, yeah, it actually matters a lot. Languages are more than just methods of communication. They actually help with identity and culture, and they are, streams of information about the past, and lots of it is being lost as languages are being lost. So we understand things, events, ourselves, and others through a process of interpretation, which occurs in language. I know from personal experience as I speak Tamil that the respect being given to elders is sort of different in different ways because you speak the language. So those sort of communication aspects are lost when languages are lost. So these are really important problems that we have to face. You also have history, which is there are so many texts being written in so many different languages, and a lot of these languages are no longer being spoken or written in or read. So there's a lot of problems associated with that. And I think the key point that I would hope everyone takes out from this is that the extinction of a language results in the irrecoverable loss of unique cultural and historical knowledge. And there's so many centuries of history of humanity, and we lose so much of it every day. Apparently, every 2 to 3 weeks, at least 1 or 2 languages are being lost, which is...
And as a result, some of them turn to drugs as a way to escape. In addition, there have actually been a lot of people injured due to the fighting, as many as 26,000 since March 30th of last year. And a lot of times these people are given opioids to combat the pain, and as a result become addicted to them. So just as a conclusion, not only is the opioid epidemic prevalent in the United States, both due to recreational abuse and people being prescribed it for pain and then becoming addicted, but it's also prevalent in other countries for various reasons, like just society in general becoming accepting of it as a way to get through the day, or as a means to escape from the pain of conflict and other things.
All right. Hello, I'm Boris. Today I'm going to be talking about plastic pollution in the oceans, and specifically how that relates to albatrosses. Here's a picture of an albatross that ate too much plastic and died. I think you should look at it for a little bit and feel bad. Good. Here's an example of a water sample taken from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is a large area of the Pacific Ocean that has very high concentration of plastic pollution. It's mostly microplastic, so it's a weird slush of specks in the water everywhere, because we're just dumping lots of plastic into the ocean, and that's what happens. It's not really like there's some media outlets that try and present it as like a solid island of like trash that you can like walk on, like a dumpster island, but that's not really the case. It's more like this, but everywhere, all the time. And naturally, that's bad for all albatrosses who live. There's about 1.5 million albatrosses that live on Midway Atoll, which is like an island right in the middle of the Great Pacific Patch. Researchers have gone there and found that almost all of them, nearly 100%, have plastic in their gastrointestinal tract. They're like finding plastic, thinking it's fish, and eating it. Almost a third of all chicks end up dying because we're feeding them too much plastic instead of fish. I don't think this is like the worst issue caused by plastic pollution in the long run. I mean, they're just albatrosses. It's not like we interact with them on a day-to-day basis. But I think the humanity of the issue is very intense here. For me at least, I like deeply sympathize and like feel very unpleasant thinking about what it's like for for a bird to have that. Like you're starving to death, and you're finding food, and your stomach is full, but you're still like starving and you can't eat because there's just plastic everywhere, no fish, and you're starving to death. It's like it's not very good. I'm sure everyone agrees with that.
Jasmine.
Okay, so I decided to focus my presentation on the refugee crisis around the world. So I guess I just wanted to start off by explaining who a refugee, like the definition of a refugee. So is anyone forced to leave their home country due to persecution, war, or violence? Yeah. And I'm also going to focus on Central and South America just because it's also something that I believe is pretty important in the news today. So in Central America, there's not necessarily war happening, but there's a lot of gang violence and crime. While doing research, I read some stories where people had to leave because, their sons were being recruited into gangs without like their consent. A lot of like their daughters were being sexually abused by gang members. It was just very hard to live in these conditions, so people had to leave. And often they send their children out on their own. And in Venezuela, especially, that's like the biggest, that's like the country where most refugees leave in South America. This is where the definition gets a little bit tricky because they're leaving due to like hyperinflation, lack of running water, more like political reasons. So I don't necessarily know if they would legally be considered refugees by that definition I mentioned earlier. But they are, but the countries that are receiving them are recognizing them as refugees. So I title this like backlash. It's more of like just like the effects of refugees being brought into these countries. So as I said before, a lot of refugees from South Sudan are going into Uganda. They are being accepted. The government is providing aid. So there's not much backlash there. However, the refugees are kind of in like a standstill in terms of their lives just because they are living in these refugee camps and they have very scarce resources. There's not a lot of food. There's not a lot of, there's no clean drinking water. They'd have to go down and boil dirty water to make it clean to drink, and even that's not necessarily safe. A lot of water that they do get gets trucked in from other places.
Sanket, I'm a pharmacology major, and my topic is on income, wealth, inequality in the world. So the facts today are basically that inequality, income inequality, and wealth inequality is very great in that top 1% of the world control about 45% of the wealth, and the bottom 64% only hold about 2% of the wealth. As well as the 10 richest billionaires in the world have more wealth than the entire annual GDP of some countries. As well as this is a bit of an increasing trend regarding these billionaires in that 380 billionaires equal the bottom 50% in wealth in 2009, but in 2017 there were only 42 billionaires equal the bottom 50%. As well as these other figures here that people who make over $30 million control about 11.3% of the wealth, so meaning that even the higher you go, the more like the concentration of wealth. So based on my research, there are different websites and different articles say that it's either increasing or decreasing, but it depends on how you frame it. So inequality is is generally increasing within many countries. However, there are some exceptions, but generally throughout the world since about like the 1980s, there's been an increase in wealth inequality. So inequality is decreasing between different countries is something that has been noted because when you take into account the entire population, global poverty has been decreasing. And, yeah, so inequality within countries is lower than between countries. However, inequality is actually declining between different countries because the poor have gotten richer, such that the amount of people in extreme poverty now is below 10% for the first time. And the global Gini coefficient dropped from 68.7 to 64.9 between 2003 and 2014. However, global inequality is still very high. And number in extreme poverty has dropped significantly, such that in South Asia, for example, so 47% were in extreme poverty in 1980, now it's 12%. In China, it was 88% in 1980, it went down to 6.5% in 2012. And that shows that Asia has done a lot in terms of reducing poverty, and that's closing the gap between economic inequality between countries like in Asia to countries in Western Europe. However, Africa still lags a bit behind in poverty reduction, but there was still a decrease such that share of Africans in poverty went from 56% in 1980 to 43% in 2010. So reflecting a decrease in poverty, and the gap between African countries and Western Europe countries is decreasing.
So I'm Leanne, and I'm going to talk about the outcomes of adults with autism spectrum disorder as like a global issue. And so autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disorder. It's very prevalent, and it's the two main components of it are deficits in social communication. So that's probably what a lot of you think about. If you picture autism, it's like not making eye contact or just having difficulty speaking or communicating with other people. And the other component is restrictive repetitive behaviors. So that could be stereotypy, insistence on sameness, restricted interest, or unusual sensory interest. So that could be like if you see like a young child like flapping their hands, that could be a repetitive behavior. Or if they have like a really narrow interest, like I know a lot of kids are like really into trains or something where they know every little thing about it. That's an example of a restrictive interest as well. And the second reason why I think this is a global issue is the outcomes of adults with autism. So adults with autism have very increased rates of morbidity and mortality. This is pretty striking because like autism doesn't come with any real physical symptoms. Some people have increased rates of seizures, but like it's not like people with autism also have heart problems, so they're more likely to die with that from that. So the reason that these rates of mortality are higher is completely due to like social consequences. So that's pretty alarming and saddening. Adults with autism also have really high rates of comorbidity. So 70% have at least one or more psychiatric disorder, and 40% have two or more psychiatric disorders. And then I think a really big reason and a big theme that we talked about in this class is that they're underemployed. So there are plenty of adults with autism who have college degrees, graduate level degrees, really smart, really capable people who are working in like service industry, fast food jobs, because for whatever reason they just wouldn't get hired elsewhere. And that's on like the higher end of the spectrum, but there are plenty of people too who like they may not have a high school diploma, but they like went to a trade school and know like a task really well that they could do, but they're still not getting hired for those tasks. So underemployment is a really big issue for this group of people. So what are we doing to improve the outcomes of adults with ASD? I thought we would end on a positive note. So right here at Stony Brook, there's a lot of research going on that's kind of like pioneering research on adults, because right now the vast majority of the literature is on children with autism spectrum disorder. So that's what gets funded, that's what journals are set up to publish about. But right now the US is collaborating, the US here at Stony Brook is collaborating with Sweden and Australia to kind of figure out what's going on and how to better the employment outcomes of adults with autism. And there's also a new journal coming out called Autism in Adulthood. And that's really exciting because right now in the field of autism, research on adults, there's not really like a home for it to go once it gets published. But now there is, so the first issue of this journal is coming out soon, and hopefully that'll like inspire researchers to look more into adult outcomes because now there's a place for that work to go.
That hate is spreading globally. The Christchurch massacre that I mentioned earlier sort of represents a really important watershed moment because it's sort of the first occurrence of a white nationalist-based attack in Oceania, like Australia and New Zealand. To the most extent, white nationalist attacks have been limited to North America and Europe for the most part. And this represents a really important moment in that it's now spreading to basically every white majority country across the globe. A really important vehicle for the transmission of these policies or of white nationalistic thinking are these online forums. So this is an online forum that I went onto in the interest of research. It's called 8chan. It's sort of like an outcropping of 4chan that's like 10 times more toxic and disgusting. These were just some clips I took of forums that people had started. They range from kind of simple things like trying to spread Hitler's teachings to outrageous conspiracy theories like Jewish complicity in 9/11, to some like really bizarre things where they're trying to, this one was interesting, they're trying to reappropriate the gay pride flag and make it a symbol of like race divisionalism. So they say like every color has its place, a separate place for every race, and those brilliant minds have called it flag acquisition general. But the more scary thing is that they tend to, in addition to the more outrageous, they tend to have more nuanced discussions. So this article was sort of, they're like presented a bunch of different theories for how they could progress towards like an ideal like master race. And they're sort of like talking about like a pragmatic approach to like developing an ethno-state of white individuals. And this one really shocked me. They're talking about CRISPR, which like I'm sure like genetics majors know all about, and how they could use it to establish like a superior like white, Aryan race, which is very alarming. So the takeaway from this is that white nationalism is a glowing global threat, that it's rooted itself deeply in North American and European political spheres. White nationalist groups often birth extremists who kill innocents in the name of racial purification, or sometimes simply to just make a statement. Online forums and other technologies tend to radicalize young and vulnerable individuals. And that the rise of white nationalism since 2016 presents an alarming trend towards a united, active, and violent global hate group that must be treated seriously. Thanks for listening, guys.
This presentation, I'm going to be talking about the oceans, but I'm going to be focusing on sort of the issues going on with our coral reefs. So I'm going to talk about what exactly is going on, why it's happening, why it's important, and then what we could do to change it. So what exactly is going on? So I hope most of us are aware that our coral reefs are being destroyed at a really alarming rate. And people say that right now the corals we have are less than half of what we had 50 years ago. And so the rate of destruction is actually twice as much as that of the rainforests, which is pretty astonishing. And some estimates, the more severe ones, say that over 90% of our reefs will be gone by the year 2050. So our kids could be the last generation to see coral reefs, which is really sad. And so why exactly are they being threatened? So they're really local factors and then more global factors. But really by far the most severe threat is the global threat of global warming and our rising atmospheric temperatures. So you can see this picture of the Earth, sort of like a warning light saying that the temperature is getting really too high, and it's really relevant. So the reason why this is that when our atmosphere warms from the increased carbon emissions, a lot of this carbon dioxide ends up in the ocean. So not only does the seawater temperature rise, but it also becomes more acidic. And basically the change in ocean chemistry directly impacts the coral. And basically these coral become very sick, and just like in this picture you can see that they become what we call bleached. And so what's actually happening is that the coral are pushing away all the algae that they normally rely on to live. So they lose all their normal bright colors, and they become really prone to even infectious disease. And they can't live like this, so what happens is they all die off. And so where in the beginning you have this colorful, vibrant ecosystem, it really turns to just this just like sea of white and just gray. And this, of course, is not supportive to sustain fish life, let alone any plant life.
Obviously, we all know water is essential to life. We all need water to survive, but we typically tend to forget how much of our life revolves around water. So all the things that I did this morning, the things that took me 20 minutes to typically an hour at most, I would not be able to do those things if I did not have a tap about a couple of feet away, if I did not have a toilet a couple of feet away, didn't have a shower a couple of feet away, or if I wasn't in the mood of having tap water, I have the luxury of going downstairs to our fine emporium and paying for slightly overpriced water. But nevertheless, I have access to it. So currently in this day, it's kind of shocking, but in 2019, at least 844 million people do not have access to safe drinking water. And this just seems like a very big arbitrary number, but that's twice the population in the United States. And that's baffling that in this time and age when water is so crucial to not only survival, but just our basic day-to-day activities, so many people lack access to it. Currently in this room, there's a little bit more than, like 20 people. So 1 in every 9 and maybe 1 in every 10 people don't have access to clean and safe drinking water. So 2 of us would not have access to water, whether that's a couple feet away or even downstairs prepackaged water. So what that would mean for our day-to-day lives is while the rest of us were able to start off our days every morning from 9 to 11, 2 of us would have to spend a good 30 minutes minimum to at least 4 hours and more, depending on where you lived, just accessing water. And most of the time, this water you would have to travel miles and miles to acquire. And it's not like you have to get water to last you at least a day, and for most people, since the distances are so far, you would have to get minimum 40 pounds, and I've seen it ranged up to like 120 pounds of water. And the water that they do acquire, it's not clean either. It's contaminated with diseases. So after you spend the good half of your day acquiring the water, you have to go back, boil it, purify it, do whatever you need to do to use it for all the things that I did in a matter of 20 minutes to an hour. And the responsibility of it. So what is the water sanitation crisis? So as I mentioned, pretty sure we all use the bathroom every day, a couple times a day. But it's honestly incredible to think that having a toilet is a luxury. So I don't know about you, but I do not use public restrooms whatsoever. They really freak me out. I think they're disgusting. Oh my God, we'll be done really quickly. But 1 in 3 people don't have access to toilet, and that has implications for disease, health, privacy, and their safeties. For example, women you can't openly defecate on the street. It's just hazardous for several reasons. But 900 million people struggle with this problem where they are defecating in public, and these are just more statistics on that. This I found honestly hysterical. More people have phones in a lot of these developing countries than toilets. And this is not wrong. I've seen Instagram posts, Facebook posts of people from countries like where I'm from, Bangladesh, posting selfies when they're in the middle of the farm. But they don't have access to clean toilets. And it's hysterical. But still, there's so much that we have left to do. And the fact that they were able to do something so quickly when they had like a goal of 15 years, they were able to do it in about 7 years. The fact that we have a solution, but we're honestly choosing not to use the solutions that we have just says a lot about the priorities globally. So summarizing it all together, clean water really changes everything. It has implications on your day-to-day lives. We would not be able to attend class if we didn't have access to clean water. We would not be able to hang out with our friends if we did not have access to clean water, because at the end of the day, it's a basic necessity and it is needed for almost everything we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Raeqa.
So I'm going to talk about corruption in healthcare specifically in India, just because it's a big thing there. So from the beginning, it all starts in medical school. There are many students who want to go to medical school, especially in India. And if you are already part of a wealthy family or of higher status, your parents or someone will pay for you to get into medical school, even though you probably don't rightfully deserve to go so. And then also exams, like the MCAT or like the step 1, like people will pay to get answers, people will pay to pass these exams, even though they rightfully shouldn't be licensed physicians. So they're known also to charge like unofficial donations to allow students who pass such exams and enter such schools. And students have been reported to like bribe faculty members in medical schools to also pass. For financial gains, this is a big one. So clinical researchers get paid by industries for the recruitment of poor and illiterate human beings because they're vulnerable as human subjects for clinical trials. So they're being taken advantage of. So some statistics, nearly about 2,900 people died in India during clinical trials of drugs conducted by various pharmaceutical companies from 2005 to 2010. That's about 7 years. And compensation was only paid in 45 cases. 49 babies had died during clinical trials for new drugs at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, which is considered a premier medical institution in India, over a period of 2.5 years. Hospitals and physicians use these patients by charging uninsured patients with health plans for more than they should be charged for people that do have health plans. So they're AKA one poor, two won't be able to afford such prices, but they're being overcharged anyways. So the connection between medical professionals and politicians and police is a major factor that's multiplying medical corruption in general. And there's also public apathy and fear that are responsible for breeding medical corruption. So when it comes to, sorry, I'll be done quick. So when people come to know about these unethical procedures and activities that are there, they turn a blind eye because they also don't want to be involved in such a mess. So that just perpetuates the issue here. So for example, many people are aware of a kidney racket, so I'll go into that later. It's about an organ trade. But they didn't report this matter to law enforcement agencies because they're afraid themselves. So there's
talking about the state of prison systems worldwide today. So there are a lot of issues, and there's a lot of reform in place and in progress, but we still have a long way to go. Understanding and resolving these issues is important in reducing the reoffending rate in the future, as well as ensuring that the human rights of prisoners are respected. So let's start on a global scale. The Global Prison Trends 2018 report issued by the PRI found that while overall crime rates around the world have declined, the number of people in prison on any given day is rising, death row and executed. Finally, in New Zealand, the Children's Commission reported that teenage boys at a youth prison had told them how staff hit them on the body where it won't mark during fight clubs held away from security cameras. Expanding on this idea of violence, I'll go into corruption and violence now. So corruption is not uncommon in prison systems. A survey in Mexico of 64,000 prisoners found that 87% of them paid bribes to guards and officials for perks such as warm showers, increased family times, and cigarettes, among many others. Prison riots are not uncommon, and gang disputes are especially common in Latin American countries. So beyond this prisoner violence, there's also violence at the hands of prison staff. For example, in Guatemala in 2017, officials were charged with manslaughter after locking up 41 adolescent girls in a state-run institution, which later caught fire and took the lives of these 41 individuals. Something that I stumbled across while doing my research was the reaction of prison staff to hunger strikes. So prisoners participate in these strikes as a way of expressing their frustration. However, they are force-fed, beat, and put into solitary confinement by prison staff as a result. At the same time, it's important to note that the violence works both ways. Prison staff also experience violence at the hands of prisoners experience. And finally, in terms of what we can do to solve this problem, there's a lot of alternatives and solutions that have been implemented, that are in progress, and that can be implemented, among which include rehabilitation centers instead of prisons, especially for those that commit minor offenses, decriminalizing minor offenses, especially those related to drug abuse, and implementing rules to protect the minority groups that I discussed earlier.
I did my presentation on gender roles, specifically with women outside of the U.S. So a lot of the stories that we read this semester from the book had talked about gender roles in one way or another. In the United States, we have a long history of fighting for women's rights, and it's important to fight for what you believe in and what's right. And so we had, in the 1920s, suffrage. In the 1970s, we had the Equal Rights Amendment Act. But women all over the world don't have these same rights. And I'm no stranger to hearing sexist comments that say, women can't do these things. My whole life I've had hobbies and interests that are not typical for women. People tell me all the time, that's not, girls can't do that, whatever it may be. But that's something so little to me. But there have been a few changes in other countries that are positive, and we need to keep moving forward with these. In Saudi Arabia, just last year, women gained the right to drive and attend sporting events and concerts, which apparently they couldn't do up until a year ago. In Egypt, Tunisia, Iraq, Yemen, and Morocco, women can now pass on citizenship to their children. They couldn't do that before. Lebanon should be just behind them. They're working on legislation now. There's a widespread repeal of laws letting rapists escape punishment if they marry their victims in this region. This is all happening within the last 2 years, whereas in the United States, these are laws that have been in place for a long time. And 9 countries adopted laws against domestic violence. Everyone hopefully knows Malala. She fought for access to education for women in her country and was shot in the head by the Taliban as a result. They specifically asked her to identify herself, and she did, but she was shot because of it. She's the youngest Nobel Prize winner, and she has had other assassination attempts threatened just because she's fighting for equal access to education for women in that area. And there's always someone less fortunate, so it's important, though, even though there are issues in this country, that we recognize that it's kind of like complaining that we're driving a used Cadillac when they don't even have a bicycle. Like, we need to focus on other countries where they really don't have anything.
The spread of misinformation on online social media. Wanted to focus on spread of misinformation on another platform. So WhatsApp is also owned by Facebook, and I was kind of more inspired to talk about WhatsApp because Facebook recently, they've announced that their direction to move on from their issues with data and fake news and misinformation is to focus on private messaging and more person-to-person interaction, groups, etc. So I was just looking at WhatsApp, which has been different in nature, but still has, had huge effects, such as I discussed, I mentioned this in class a few weeks ago, but in India, there's a big issue with WhatsApp lynchings. It sounds a bit strange and bizarre, but a lot of rumors that are circulated on WhatsApp, really provocative, really graphic, disturbing rumors are spread through WhatsApp, and those are prompts a lot of mobs to murder or lynch people, and this is usually in rural areas, and there's been 46 deaths since May 2017, which is a lot. You don't think of people getting lynched nowadays. So in addition to this, it's been used by both political parties in the general election to influence the public opinion and spread propaganda. And in addition, not even in India, WhatsApp is used in many countries. In Brazil, it was used to circulate Fox News. And but the first example, I think, is a little bit less concerning to me because I read these things a lot, and I just kind of dismiss them as being kind of silly. I'll just summarize it because there's a lot of text. It's supposed to be that if at 40 degrees Celsius, if you drink ice water quickly, your blood vessels could explode. And going through explaining this, this, and I think one of the issues is that I think this is a global issue, not even in the U.S. I feel like if I ask all of you guys, how many of you is social media you use it for at least some of your news? Most people, right? So media literacy is a huge issue, especially when we're bombarded by information all the time, and especially for people who are quickly getting access to large amounts of information that they didn't have before, just because technology is so cheap now, and it's so cheap to just publish and forward and share information. This low media literacy, it really is preventing us from seeing what are the real issues, and especially when it comes to public opinion. If everybody's circulating information that nuclear energy is evil and it's gonna kill us all, or that climate change is a myth, it's not gonna help us solve any of these global issues.
Thank you. So it's on loneliness and social isolation. It's rising, trending upwards globally. So there was a global study done in 2018 that surveyed the United States, the United Kingdom, and Japan on how isolated and lonely they feel. And approximately, so people who claim they are lonely is around under 25% in the West and 9 to 10% in Japan. So loneliness and social isolation is linked to many health problems and problems such as financial hardships. It's also usually this debate on it, but that social media and technology is causing increasing loneliness because people don't communicate with each other face to face. And although Japan reports lower rates of loneliness, only 10% say they feel lonely, but they experience more severe consequences, as the politics suicide thing earlier. And people are not marrying and living together with their family nowadays as much. So the trend of people who live alone goes up over the years, and that often results in social isolation, where they just they end up not contacting friends or family for a long period of time, such as 7% of Europeans have not reached out or talked to their family or friends in over a year. This was 2014, I think. The potential reasons for loneliness, there's no actual, you can't really quantify it exactly other than surveys, but it's usually employment and physical isolation, so the use of technology. Some people blame the government for not spending enough money on it, and the conclusion is it's difficult to assign responsibility to fix this, so you can't really prompt healthcare programs exactly. So it's also a solution of socializing, but it's a lot more complicated than just telling somebody to go socialize. And this is like a case. Oh, okay, that's not. Never mind. Okay, that's the sources. Yeah, it's a different version.
Okay, so my presentation is about nuclear power and the public opinion, discussing a little bit about what nuclear power is, what the public views about nuclear power, what they know, what the history of nuclear power is and how it works, and the importance of it in the future. So the first thing I want to discuss is, how does power generation work? Power generation is really important, as many people in the world do not have power, and power pretty much runs. So just sort of like a recap, you have water and a bunch of heat, you make some pressurized steam, and you rotate a turbine, and then you make electricity. So you're turning mechanical work into electrical energy. So nuclear power is different from other power plants by how they actually generate their heat. Whereas in fossil fuel plants, you actually burn the coal to create the heat. In nuclear power plants, you use a fission reaction, or theorize a fusion reaction, to actually generate your heat, to actually turn those turbines. Then it's time to talk about the health risks of nuclear power. Oh, and everything just went backwards. Okay. So the health risks. So where's like the pollution in nuclear power coming from? If you think about other power plants, you think about contamination of the air, you think contamination of the water, right? How does that play with nuclear power? With nuclear power, the actual generation of the heat does not cause that much air pollution. It doesn't cause really any pollution at all. It comes from kind of the extremity processes, such as mining the fuel, generating the structures for nuclear power plants, and also the waste pollution, where you have this radioactive fuel that's already burnt up, but it's still giving off radiation. And so you would actually encapsulate these in sort of like, I've seen like online pictures of like large vats of water where they keep all the radioactive fuel that was burnt up inside the water, so it doesn't like reach the air. And so a lot of the pollution could leak out if you consider maybe something like a disaster where the radioactive fuel is then exposed to the environment. And there are multiple famous instances of that actually happening. And so I want to discuss a little bit about that. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the role of nuclear power in satisfying energy needs. So as you know, and as we mentioned earlier, global warming is a very pressing geopolitical issue. It affects everyone. It affects people that aren't people, like even like polar bears and stuff. And so like we really like the polar bears, and so we don't want them to die, obviously. And so we want to seek for ways to produce clean energy. We want to seek that energy fast because honestly, global warming is increasing the planet's temperature pretty much every month or every year, and we want to try to slow that down. Now, what nuclear power has, which many other fuel sources don't, like fossil fuels, is a zero carbon footprint, meaning that it doesn't produce any greenhouse gases. It doesn't produce basically anywhere near the magnitude of pollution that fossil fuels does. And so it seems to be that nuclear power could be the frontier of the energy needs of the world. For example, right now, 14% of the world remains completely in the dark, so without any electricity. And so even just a few nuclear power plants scattered around the world could start to satisfy those energy needs. And as of recently, for the Trump administration, there's been significant budget cuts to the nuclear energy departments, pretty bad, right? Because that's our energy, right? That's our clean energy. And most of that money that was cut is going into fossil fuels. And so we're looking for ways, obviously, to try to work around that and try to promote healthy energy and do some more research on keeping these power plants safe. I looked at some statistics earlier. There were 2 power plants in particular that were really bad, like level 7 bad, which is the highest level, which was Chernobyl and Fukushima. And there was only 1 level 6 and like 2 level 5s, and everything else was like very minor incidents. And so from the major accidents that we've seen in the past, it really highly sways public opinion. And so it's important to keep the public educated on nuclear power because it could be the one shot we got. So yeah, that's my
So, hey, my topic is violence against women, which I consider to be a global epidemic at this point. This is a topic that's pretty relevant today, both on a global scale and, in the communities around us. So intimate partner violence, an interesting statistic I found regarding it is that worldwide 1 in 2 women are killed or were killed by their partners or family in 2012. So that's not too long ago, and I haven't really found any significant policy changes in the last, 7 years that may look to changing that, so it's something pretty startling. And also 75% of countries have gone on to outlaw domestic violence. 78 of these countries criminalize marital rape. So that's not really significant in number compared to how many nations actually go through things like this. And marital rape is probably one of the bigger forms of intimate partner violence. Another huge thing that's especially addressed in this country is sexual violence and harassment. And this can occur in nearly every setting, which makes it so significant. So approximately 15 million adolescent girls from the ages of 15 to 19 worldwide have experienced forced sex or rape at some point in their life, as per 2017, which is 2 years ago. So this is a kind of global look at it. Again, this is not a problem that occurs halfway across the world. It can occur right here, even in developed nations. You can kind of see the statistical breakdown in this map. I'm not going to go through it. But these are the WHO regions that are highlighted. So the World Health Organization found statistics from these areas, and they pulled them out and extracted them right here. Again, these are probably underrepresentations of this data because this is what is reported. But again, you'll find several areas where none of this information is on record, so keep that in mind. And this is intimate partner violence in specific. And these are just some of the implications of it for the women. These are short-term, directly relating to women. Mental health, sexual reproductive health, and the eventual death and injury that might result from this violence. And this last slide, I promise I'll show you. These are some macro scale implications that were completely startling to me. Like I didn't even have any understanding of why they work, so I kind of had to do some research on it. So in places where women don't have the autonomy to make their social or reproductive decisions, so that's access to birth control, it's if they're forced to marry and bear children at a younger age, the whole society suffers on a larger scale. What I mean by this is you'll see these nations in poverty because where women work and they have their own autonomy, economies grow. Empowering these women boosts economic growth, it boosts economic diversification, and it lessens that economic inequality.
So I'm gonna present about the plastic problem and its impact on coastal populations. So now on to the dilemma for fishermen and coastal populations. So microplastics can damage like the fishing gear, like the nets, the hooks, the propellers. And I want to talk about 2 countries and fishermen from those regions. So in Ghana, there is a meeting at World Oceans Day regarding plastic pollution. And then there's one quote from a fisherman that says, "All I could catch these days is polythene. It's affecting our work because we buy fuel and we gain nothing. The plastic in the sea also kills the fishes." So you see how these people's livelihoods are affected. And there's also some sort of like, they like admit, the fishermen in Ghana also admit that like they're part of the problem because when they go out to fish in the sea, they bring food and they with like that's packed in plastic and they always throw it out in the sea. So they're part of the problem as well. So it's a good thing that they're conscious about the issue. And then also another situation in Kerala, India, one person said that the pollution of the Arabian Sea is India's greatest failure. But to combat this, like the people of Kerala have realized the problem at hand, so they created a recycling program. So they removed plastic from their daily cash and disposed of it properly. And it's like a very severe issue. Like the oceans are really polluted, and you can see that like 4 tons of plastic are collected in 10 days from like just a small group. And the government has established a recycling facility, and it specifically supports female employment and empowerment by giving them a job to sort out the plastic they find in the ocean. But they're only paid like $5 a day. And you see that like this is, although they're helping the environment, it's such a great task that they have to burden themselves with, and it takes away time from their actually livelihood and their daily lives. They spend hours a day full time just sorting out plastic when if we reduce the use of plastic, like this can all be avoided. So like I said, it affects their livelihood, and it's like a whole chain of events. If there's plastic in the ocean, then fish are going to die from these consuming these plastics, and there's going to be less of a catch for these fishermen. And when they go home, they can't sell fish, or they have to raise the prices of fish, and their livelihoods are affected. And especially the lower class, whose diet may depend mostly on fish, they can't afford these things, and now their whole livelihoods are affected. So it's like a whole community, whole region is at risk. And this is an image from Kerala, India, of fishermen collecting their catch, and like you can see there's plastic everywhere, like in the ocean. And here there's another man from Kerala. He's repairing his net that was damaged by plastic. And okay, last thing is that so we see all these problems, and like sometimes government agencies can apply regulations to reduce the amount of plastic that's produced, or we could reduce the amount of plastic that we consume or buy. I want to highlight like a model society in Kamakatsu, Japan, that talks about their reduction of waste. And so it's a small island, a small town in the island, Shikoku Island, and they actually have the whole town gathers together to a facility and organizes their waste into 45 categories. They manually sort all their waste by hand, and there's no garbage truck collection. They all do it by themselves. So they sort their own waste into proper bins and recycle it properly, and reuse those plastics for other goods and repurpose them. And the cost of recycling these products is 1/6 the price of incinerating them otherwise. And they've gotten to the point where 80% of all their waste is recycled. And it's like amazing. They aim to be 100% by 2020. And although some of the citizens, they're voted to say like this is a really big inconvenience, but I feel obliged to do it because of the societal pressure and the culture that we have in Japan. I think we could really learn from that. That although this is an inconvenience, like abandoning plastics or reducing the use of plastics, it's necessary for us to survive as like a population. But yeah.